Bars sat at the train station, day after day, night after night. The sounds of the place, wheels scraping against the tracks, the mechanical screech of trains slowing to a halt, hurried footsteps against the concrete, voices calling out goodbyes and greetings, had long since become background noise to him. He paid them no mind. His world had shrunk to a single point, the platform. He had arrived 4 years ago, a proud and strong German shepherd with thick fur and sharp, intelligent eyes. At first, people assumed he belonged to one of the passengers, a traveler who had momentarily stepped away. Maybe his owner had boarded a train, expecting to return soon. But the minutes stretched into hours, then into days. Bars did not move. The station workers were the first to notice him. They tried to shoo him away. Dogs weren't allowed to loiter around the platforms. But he didn't react as strays usually did. He didn't bark, didn't run, didn't cower. He simply stepped back, avoiding them, and resumed his place. His eyes never wavered from the platform, scanning each new arrival, each departing figure. A week passed, then another. The station workers stopped trying to make him leave. It was clear he wouldn't go. They gave him a name, Bars. It suited him, with his alert posture and unwavering stance, like a soldier at his post. People came and went, thousands of them. Travelers rushing to catch their trains, families reuniting, lovers embracing, children laughing as they ran ahead of their parents. The station was a place of movement, of change, of fleeting moments. But Bars remained the only constant. Seasons changed. Winter came first, cruel and unforgiving. The wind howled through the open spaces of the station, carrying sharp gusts of ice and snow. Bars curled up under a bench, tucking his nose beneath his tail, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The ground was cold beneath him, seeping into his bones, but he did not leave. Some travelers noticed him, stopping in their hurried paths to watch the lone dog lying in the snow. A few tried to help. An old woman wrapped a scarf around him. A young man placed a piece of bread near his paws. But Bars barely touched the food. He only ate enough to stay alive. The station workers built him a small wooden shelter near one of the kiosks, a weak attempt to protect him from a cold. Sometimes he used it, but mostly he stayed out in the open, watching the platform. Always watching. Spring arrived, thawing the frost that had gripped the station. Rain replaced the snow, falling in soft sheets that turned the ground into puddles. Bars shook the water from his fur, sitting upright even as the rain soaked him. The air smelled fresh, full of new beginnings, but for him, nothing changed. He waited. Summer was relentless. The heat radiated off the pavement, making the metal rails shimmer in the distance. Bars panted in the shade, his tongue lolling from his mouth, but he never left his spot. A woman who worked at a nearby food stall started leaving bowls of water for him. He drank, slow and measured, as if conserving his strength. His fur, once thick and strong, grew dull under the sun, but his posture remained unyielding. By now, his presence was no longer a mystery. People whispered about him. Someone had posted a picture of him online, calling him the dog who waits. Travelers stopped to take photos. Children pointed at him, asking their parents why the dog was there. Some said he was waiting for a master who had died. Others speculated that his owner had abandoned him. But the truth didn't matter, because Bars didn't know it. Autumn arrived, painting the station in golden brown. Leaves scattered across the platforms. The air grew crisp, and the days shortened. Bars' fur thickened again in preparation for another winter. His ribs were more visible now, his body thinner than it had been 4 years ago. But he did not move. He still did not trust people. The workers had given up trying to take him in. Some had tried in the early years, coaxing him with food, calling him gently, even attempting to lead him away with a leash. But Bars avoided them all. When they got too close, he would step back, his ears lowering slightly, his tail motionless. He never bared his teeth, never growled. He was not afraid. He simply did not trust, because in his mind, there was only one person he belonged to, and that person had not returned. For years passed this way. The world around Bars shifted and moved, like a river flowing past an immovable rock. He watched strangers step off trains, saw families embrace, saw friends reunite, lovers run into each other's arms. He saw sorrow, joy, excitement, exhaustion. But no one ever stepped off a train and called his name. No one ever searched for him the way he searched for them. And so he remained, waiting. Journalist Ethan Miller had always prided himself on his ability to find stories where others saw only the mundane. It was his instinct, his craft, seeing what others missed, uncovering what lay beneath the surface. But even he hadn't expected to find his next major piece while rushing through a crowded train station, balancing a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He first noticed the dog in passing. At first glance, Bars didn't seem particularly different from any other stray. A large German shepherd, lean with hunger but still proud, sitting near the platform like a silent guardian. Ethan barely spared him a thought, until he passed through the station again a week later. Bars was still there, sitting in the exact same spot, his dark eyes fixed on the arriving trains, his ears twitching at every movement. There was something eerie about his stillness, something unsettling about the unwavering patience in his posture. Ethan paused, lowering his phone, watching. The dog did not beg. He did not seek attention. He simply waited. Something about it gnawed at Ethan. He had been a journalist long enough to recognize when a story was buried beneath something ordinary. The city was full of strays, but none quite like this. Dogs didn't just sit in one place for 4 years unless they were waiting for something or someone. He decided to ask around. The station workers knew him immediately. Bars, one of them said, leaning against the ticket booth with a knowing look. Been here forever. We tried to take him in, but he won't leave. How long? Ethan asked, scribbling in his worn notebook. 4 years, came the answer. Ever since his owner boarded a train and never came back. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. And no one knows who the owner was? The man shrugged. Some say he belonged to a local. Guy just up and left one day. Train came, doors closed, and the dog stayed behind. Never moved since. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. A dog abandoned at a station, waiting for someone who had long since disappeared. There was a sadness to it that lodged itself deep in his gut. But more than that, there was a story. He spent the next few days piecing together what little information he could find. Bars had not always been a stray. He had belonged to someone who had lived in this city, who had walked these streets. But who? Ethan combed through old records, interviewed locals, even searched online forums where people had posted pictures of the dog who waited. The deeper he dug, the more the mystery grew. Why had the owner left? Did they know Bars was still waiting? Had they abandoned him deliberately? Or had something happened that prevented them from coming back? The questions haunted him. The more Ethan uncovered, the heavier the weight in his chest became. There was an unease in the air, a tension he couldn't shake. Every answer led to more uncertainty. He returned to the station daily, watching Bars, trying to decipher the mind of an animal that could not speak. The dog had grown thinner over the years, his fur weathered by time and neglect. His body told a story of suffering, of unwavering loyalty, of a love that refused to die, even when it was met with nothing but silence. And yet, despite everything, Bars still did not trust people. Ethan had seen the attempts, the way passengers tried to coax him, the gentle hands that reached out, only for Bars to shrink away, to step back as if the mere idea of being touched by another human was unbearable. Ethan hated it. Hated the idea of a creature so devoted that he was willing to waste away, to refuse comfort, to reject the kindness of strangers because of a hope that had long since turned to dust. It was humiliating in a way, watching an animal refuse to accept what was right in front of him. Bars was alone. His master was not coming back. And yet, he sat, watching, waiting, believing in something that had abandoned him. The world had moved on. Bars had not. The thought made Ethan sick. He continued his investigation, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that he would find something, anything, to make sense of it all. The city was full of forgotten people, forgotten places, and now a forgotten dog. He had to know the truth, because if he didn't, who would? Bars had not always been the dog that waited. There had been a time before the station, before the cold cement beneath his paws, before the endless parade of strangers passing him by. There had been a home, A routine, a quiet life built in the shadows of the city. There had been a man who had spoken to him, walked with him, lived his days with him as if they were the only two souls in the world. That man had been Henry Clark. Henry had never been a figure of significance to the world at large. He had no grand achievements, no wealth or power, no presence that turned heads when he walked down the street. But to Bars, Henry was everything. His scent, his voice, the familiar shuffle of his footsteps as he returned home at the same time every evening. These were the things that made up Bars' world. The world that had once been steady, unshaken. The world that had existed before the waiting began. Henry Clark had been 40 years old. He had lived a life that was quiet, structured, predictable. Every morning, he rose before the sun, moving through his apartment with the efficiency of habit, shower, coffee, keys in his pocket. Bars knew the rhythm of it well. He would sit by the door, ears perked, waiting for the moment Henry reached for the leash. Their morning walk was never missed, not once in all the years they had spent together. It was their time, the city still drowsy, the streets empty save for the early risers heading to work. Henry would speak as they walked, his voice low and thoughtful, never expecting a response, but knowing Bars was listening. "You're the only one who understands, aren't you?" he would say, ruffling the thick fur behind Bars' ears. It was a routine so deeply ingrained in both of them that Henry never considered a life where it didn't exist. His days were simple. He worked at a small auto repair shop just a few blocks from home, a job he had held for years, fixing cars for the same familiar faces that passed through town. He was not particularly close to anyone. His coworkers knew him, but they didn't know him. He had no wife, no children, no friends that ever visited. It was just him and Bars, and that was enough. Every evening, after the last car had been repaired, after the smell of grease and metal had faded from his hands, he would return home, unlocking the door to the sound of paws scrambling across the floor to greet him. Another walk, another quiet conversation spoken into the night air. A life of repetition, of small comforts, of unspoken loyalty. But life had a way of taking even the simplest things and turning them into something fragile. The phone call had come late one evening, the shrill ring breaking the silence of his apartment. Henry had hesitated before answering, sensing something before a word had even been spoken. He had not been wrong. His mother was sick. The voice on the other end of the line had belonged to a distant relative, someone who had spoken in clipped sentences, relaying facts without feeling. She needed care. There was no one else. If he could come soon, it would be best. Henry had stood there for a long time after hanging up, staring at nothing, Bars sitting quietly at his feet as if sensing the shift in the air. Leaving had not been something he had ever planned for. His life had been built within the boundaries of this city, in a small apartment with the creaky floorboards, in the streets where he had walked Bars every morning and evening without fail. He had never thought of anything beyond it, but his mother needed him, and so he had packed a bag. He had taken only what he thought would be necessary. A few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a notebook filled with old addresses and numbers that hadn't been dialed in years. He had moved through the apartment as if sleepwalking, the weight of the decision pressing down on his chest. Bars had followed him from room to room, watching. When the time had come, when there was nothing left to do but go, Henry had hesitated. He had gripped Bars' leash tightly in his hand, standing at the door, looking down at the dog who had never known a day without him. "I'll be back," he had murmured, almost as if he could make it true by speaking the words aloud. The city had been awake by then, the streets bustling with the early morning crowd. The walk to the station had been slow, Henry's grip firm on the leash as Bars trotted beside him. It had felt wrong, every step heavy, every sound distant. And then the station. The final moment. Henry had stood on the platform, his bag slung over his shoulder, Bars sitting at his feet as the train pulled in. He had crouched down, pressing his forehead against Bars, breathing in the familiar scent of his fur. "You stay here," he had whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the station. "I'll be back before you know it." And then he had turned. Bars had watched as he stepped onto the train, watched as the doors slid shut. watched as the metal beast carried Henry away, further and further until he disappeared entirely. And then Bars had waited. He had waited in that exact spot, ears perked, eyes locked onto the tracks, as if expecting Henry to return at any moment. He had not moved, had not chased after the train, had not understood that sometimes when people leave, they do not come back. But Henry had not known, either. He had left believing he would return, believing that soon, he and Bars would walk through the streets again, that their life would resume as if nothing had changed. He had not known that the world had already shifted beneath his feet, that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan Miller had spent years chasing stories, but none had ever consumed him like this one. Bars, the dog who had waited, the symbol of undying loyalty, of devotion beyond human understanding. The story had haunted him from the moment he first saw the German Shepherd sitting by the train platform, watching every arriving train with those dark, desperate eyes. He had spent weeks unraveling the past, following the thin, frayed threads of a man's life, piecing together the tragic separation that had left Bars alone. And now, it was time to share it with the world. Ethan had poured himself into the article, writing with the precision of a man who knew he was crafting something unforgettable. He detailed everything, how Bars had once belonged to a quiet, unremarkable man named Henry Clark, how they had been inseparable, how one sudden departure had torn them apart. He described the way Bars had refused to move, the way he had ignored kindness, rejected comfort, clinging to a loyalty that the world had long since deemed pointless. He painted a picture of the seasons passing, of the cold winters and blistering summers, of the thousands of strangers who had walked past, never understanding the weight of what they were witnessing. And then he wrote about Henry. He described the man who had left, believing he would return. A man who had never meant to abandon his dog, who had loved him so deeply that even in his absence, his presence had lingered in the heart of the creature who had refused to forget. When Ethan hit publish, he expected the story to do well. He had written enough viral pieces to know when something would resonate with people. But he had not expected what came next. The response was immediate, explosive. Within hours, the article had been shared thousands of times. Social media lit up with discussions, debates, and messages of heartbreak. People demanded updates. News stations picked up the story. The dog who waited became a symbol of unconditional love, a heartbreaking testament to devotion in a world that often discarded it. Ethan watched in stunned silence as it unfolded. Messages flooded his inbox, some from strangers offering to adopt Bars, others from journalists who wanted interviews. But then came a message that made his breath catch in his throat. It was an email. Short. Simple. I think Bars is my dog. My name is Henry Clark. Ethan read it 3 times before his brain fully processed what he was seeing. He felt his pulse quicken, his hands trembling slightly as he typed back a response, asking for proof. The reply came quickly, an old photograph attached to the email. A younger Bars sitting by the feet of a man Ethan had only seen in grainy identification records. It was him. Henry Clark was alive. He had seen the article by chance. Someone had shared it on a forum he occasionally visited. He had clicked out of mild curiosity, and then his world had stopped. He had stared at the screen, barely breathing, as he saw the dog in the photograph. His dog, the one he had been forced to leave behind, the one he had thought was long gone. Henry didn't hesitate. He packed a bag, booked the first ticket back to the city he had left behind, and within hours he was on his way. The journey felt unreal. He barely noticed the passing landscapes, the chatter of passengers, the rhythmic hum of the train beneath him. His mind was stuck in the past, flashes of Bars as a pup, their walks through the city, the last heartbreaking moment at the station. He had never forgotten, but he had believed, like most people would, that Bars had moved on, that he had found another home, another person, that life had taken him in a different direction. But he had been wrong. The train pulled into the station. Henry stepped onto the platform, his heart hammering so violently it was painful. And then he saw him. Bars was sitting in his usual spot, just as Ethan had described. His fur was duller, his frame thinner, but it was him. And Henry felt his breath catch in his throat, emotions surging through him so fast they nearly knocked him off his feet. His voice trembled when he spoke. Bars. The dog's ears twitched. His body tensed. He turned his head sharply, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His dark eyes locked onto Henry's, searching. Bars, it's me, boy. The moment of hesitation lasted less than a second. And then Bars ran. Not walked. Not approached cautiously like he had with strangers before. He sprinted, closing the distance between them in an instant. A choked sound escaped Henry's throat as the dog lunged at him, pressing his weight against him, paws digging into his chest, his face burying into Henry's shoulder. Bars wasn't just wagging his tail. He was trembling, whining, his entire body shaking with emotion. For years of waiting, of loneliness, of not understanding why Henry had never come back. And now here he was. Henry dropped to his knees, gripping the dog's face in his hands, staring at him as if afraid he might disappear. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Bars didn't care. He licked Henry's face, nudging against him, pressing as close as possible as if afraid Henry might vanish again. People in the station had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the reunion. Ethan stood at a distance, feeling an overwhelming mixture of awe and relief. He had spent so long trying to uncover the truth, trying to make sense of the heartbreak that had unfolded at this station. And now, in front of him, was the ending he hadn't dared to believe was possible. Henry had come back, and Bars had never stopped believing he would. The ride home should have felt like a victory, a moment of peace after years of waiting and suffering. But as Henry sat in the back of the cab, Bars pressed tightly against his side, he could feel the tremors running through the dog's body. The excitement of the reunion had passed, and now something else had taken its place. Hesitation, uncertainty. Bars had waited for Henry for 4 long years, but now that he was finally by his side again, the world felt unfamiliar. The station had been his home, the cold pavement his bed, the arrival and departure of trains his only sense of time. He had learned to survive on his own, to avoid people, to never trust hands that reached out to him. Now, suddenly, he was being taken away from everything he had come to know. Henry could feel it, the way Bars pressed into him for comfort but kept his ears flattened. The way his muscles tensed with every unfamiliar sound of the city outside the cab's windows. The way his breathing, once calm, had begun to quicken, like a soldier being pulled away from the battlefield but still expecting danger at every turn. Henry stroked his fur slowly. You're okay, boy. We're going home. Bars didn't respond. Henry's old apartment looked exactly the same. It was eerie, in a way, like stepping back into a life he had abandoned. The same peeling wallpaper, the same creaky floorboards, the same couch where Bars had once curled up beside him after long days. But now, as Henry pushed the door open and stepped inside, Bars hesitated. He didn't rush in, didn't wag his tail, or explore like a dog returning to a familiar place. Instead, he lingered at the threshold, his body half lowered, his eyes darting across the dimly lit space as if expecting a trap. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. You remember this place, don't you? His voice was soft, almost pleading. It's home. Bars took a slow step forward, his paws barely making a sound against the wooden floor. But something was wrong. Henry could see it. The way Bars' body was too rigid, the way his tail stayed low, the way his breath came in short, shallow bursts. And then, suddenly, Bars turned and bolted. Not towards Henry. Away. Straight out the door, claws scraping against the floor as he shoved past Henry's legs. Panic shot through Henry like ice water. Bars! He ran after him, his heart pounding. Bars had made it halfway down the hallway before Henry caught up, throwing himself forward and managing to grab the loose folds of the dog's collar. Bars skidded to a stop, his body twisting in resistance, his breath wild and ragged. Henry held on, his grip firm but gentle. Hey, he panted. Hey, it's okay. You're okay. Bars didn't look okay. His chest heaved, his ears flattened, and for the first time since their reunion, Henry saw something in his eyes that hurt. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. Henry had expected joy, comfort, a return to normalcy. He had imagined Bars curling up on his old bed, settling into the familiar warmth of home. But this was something else. Bars was afraid to be inside. For years of sleeping on cold concrete, for years of learning that walls meant confinement, that closed doors meant being trapped, that trust could be a dangerous thing. For years of loneliness that had stripped him of what home was supposed to be. And now, he didn't know how to be part of it again. Henry's throat tightened. He could feel the humiliation of it, the sting of realizing that even though Bars had never stopped waiting for him, the scars of those years apart were deeper than he had imagined. He loosened his grip, giving Bars the space to move. The dog stayed frozen for a moment before slowly lowering himself to the floor, his body pressed against the wall as if making himself smaller. Henry ran a hand down his face. "All right," he murmured, his voice thick. "Okay, we'll do this your way." That night, Henry didn't force Bars inside. Instead, he brought out an old blanket and laid it on the small balcony outside his apartment. He left the door open, sitting near it, but never stepping too close. Bars curled up on a blanket, his body tense, his head never fully lowering to rest. He was listening, waiting. Henry sat with him for hours, the city sounds humming in the background. "You know," he said eventually, "I never meant to leave you." Bars didn't move, but Henry kept talking anyway. "I thought I'd be back in a few weeks. Thought everything would go back to normal. But life doesn't work like that, does it?" He gave a humorless chuckle, staring at the flickering streetlights. "I don't know what you've been through, boy. I can't imagine it. But I know you're not the same. I get it. And I'm not going to rush you, all right?" Bars let out a small breath, his ears twitching at Henry's voice. It was the beginning. Days passed, then weeks. Bars never fully entered the apartment. He would take hesitant steps inside, sniffing the air, only to retreat to the balcony again. He flinched at sudden sounds, stiffened whenever Henry moved too quickly. He still expected the world to take something away from him. Henry didn't push. He waited. He left the door open, always. He sat outside with Bars at night, drinking coffee and talking to him the way he used to, his voice patient, never demanding. He placed food near the doorway, never forcing Bars to eat inside, letting him decide when he was ready. Slowly, so slowly, things changed. One night, Bars lay halfway inside the doorway, his paws still on the balcony, but his head resting inside, close enough that Henry could hear his slow, steady breathing. A few nights later, Henry woke up to a sound he hadn't heard in years, the quiet shuffle of paws against the floor. He turned his head, barely breathing. Bars was inside. Not fully, not yet, but he had stepped beyond the threshold, into the room where they had once lived together. Henry didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched as Bars curled up near the couch, his body still tense, but no longer trembling. It took weeks before Bars finally stayed inside all night. Months before his body truly relaxed, before the tension melted from his muscles, before the nightmares stopped making him jolt awake. But it happened, because Henry never gave up. And one day, Bars finally believed he didn't have to be afraid anymore. The first time Bars ran again, really ran, Henry almost didn't believe it. It had been a slow process, full of quiet moments, hesitant steps, long nights spent on the balcony where Bars still felt safest. Henry had watched, waited, and never forced him. But even as the fear began to fade from Bars' eyes, even as he started trusting again, Henry had wondered if his dog would ever truly be himself again. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Bars surprised him. They were in the park, the same one they used to walk through every day before everything fell apart. Henry had kept him on a leash, not because he didn't trust him, but because Bars still held a certain stiffness in his body, as if he hadn't yet figured out if he was allowed to be happy again. And then, something changed. A gust of wind sent a cluster of golden leaves tumbling across the grass, swirling in the air like dancing embers. Bars watched them, his ears perking, his body tensing, not with fear, but with instinct. And then he bolted. Henry barely had time to react before the leash slipped through his fingers, and Bars was running. Not running away, not escaping, running because he wanted to, because for the first time in years, something inside him let go. Henry stood there, frozen, as Bars dashed across the field, kicking up leaves behind him, his paws striking the earth with a force that made Henry's chest tighten. He could hear the sharp breath of the wind, the rustling of trees, but above all, he heard Bars' joy, the sound of paws hitting the ground, the sharp, eager breaths of a dog who had forgotten what it meant to be free. It had been 4 years. 4 years of waiting, of stillness, of carrying the unbearable weight of loss. But now Bars was alive again. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his throat tightening as he watched the dog who had once only waited rediscover the feeling of movement. And then Bars turned back. He skidded to a stop, his chest rising and falling with deep, exhilarated breaths. His eyes locked onto Henry's, and for a moment, the world stood still. Then, before Henry could say anything, Bars sprinted back toward him. Henry barely had time to brace himself before Bars crashed into him, his paws pressing against Henry's chest, his tail wagging so wildly it knocked against Henry's legs. A bark, a real bark, loud and full of life, tore from Bars' throat, and before Henry knew it, he was laughing, stumbling back as Bars licked his face, nudging him, alive again in every possible way. Henry gripped the sides of Bars' face, pressing their foreheads together like he had done the last time they were at the station. "You're back," he whispered. "You're really back." And Bars was. It wasn't just that he had returned home. It wasn't just that he had learned to trust again. It was that he had allowed himself to move forward. From that moment on, things changed. Bars no longer hesitated when Henry opened the door. He no longer paused at thresholds, no longer flinched at unexpected noises. He lived. They went on longer walks. The stiffness in Bars' body disappeared, replaced by something lighter, something freer. He no longer slept on the balcony. He took his place on the old couch again, curling into the same worn-out corner where he used to rest. One night, Henry woke up to find Bars sprawled across the bed beside him, his paws twitching in his sleep. Henry had smiled in the darkness, reaching out to rest a hand on his dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Everything had changed, and yet, somehow, it had all come full circle. Bars was home, but their story did not end there. Ethan Miller, the journalist who had brought them back together, had not stopped writing about them. The world had followed Bars' journey, from the dog who had waited for years to the dog who had found his way back home. People shared the story across countries, across languages, across cultures. Bars became a symbol of loyalty, of love, of the power of waiting. People saw themselves in him. They saw their own losses, their own heartbreaks, their own struggles in the way he had refused to let go. They saw hope in the way he had survived. Bars had never understood the world of humans, their complexities, their ability to move on, to forget. But the world understood him. He became a reminder that animals feel, that they remember, that they never forget those they love. A reminder that sometimes waiting isn't weakness. It's faith.